Yeah, welcome to our seminar series, Everything is Energy. And this is about the 8th seminar in our series. And I think to date, we've kind of confirmed what our speaker, Kyhl Lyndgaard, says in his abstract, that the topic of energy immediately kind of generates concerns about practicalities of cost, environment, technology, and in our case, of course, our production crisis. But as he says, and as our seminar title actually suggests, there's much more to the notion of energy in the human experience. So today we are going to take a kind of a broader view, guided by Kyhl, who is a member of the Environmental Studies Department at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, Minnesota, US. He holds a PhD in literature and environment, and he'll be taking us on a literary excursion detailing the emergence of energy literature on petrofiction and oil culture, if I have him right. So Kyhl, thank you, and over to you.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to Andrea for organizing this, to Iscia. I should say that also to NMU and my home institution for having me here. I've been in the country now for about 4 months, leading a study abroad program, and it's actually the 25th year since we started this program. And by a weird quirk, I was on that original inaugural year in 1998. Had not been to South Africa since, so this is a real pleasure. Yeah, so as mentioned, I'll present on energy and literature. I can't cover all energy regimes in literature in a single talk, so I'll focus on oil culture, or what's often called in shorthand petrofiction. I had a 2015 book on this topic, trying to expose a wider audience to specific texts. So I'm going to be reading those at length. I really like that idea of the excursion through energy and literature. That big question, though, remains, right? How do we connect literary production to a subject usually considered from a technical standpoint? I'll cover some American ideas and try to mix in some things I've been learning about here in South Africa. Here, you know, energy awareness is at a all-time high, maybe. Load shedding is everyday discussion. Maybe a silver lining is that visibility of energy, that awareness does make the cultural production piece that much more relatable. All right, so let's look at an axiom of literature and writing, right? Simply put, we write what we know. So broadly outlining that relationship between energy and culture. I assume energy to be a critical environmental and social issue. You know, a lot of this is due to concerns over the climate crisis, but cheap, abundant energy has been a dominating fact of Western life for a long time. Since I do work at a Catholic institution, it's been kind of useful for me when I work with my students to lean on somebody like the Pope Francis, whose encyclical Laudato Si, or subtitled "Care for Our Common Home," can be a useful piece for me. So Francis wrote, "It cannot be maintained that empirical science provides a complete explanation of life, the interplay of all creatures, and the whole of reality. If we reason only within the confines of the latter, little room would be left for aesthetic sensibility, poetry, or even reason's ability to grasp the ultimate meaning and purpose of things." So I really appreciate that strong assertion on the value of creative expression. And in fact, human expression on energy is much older than even what the written word allows. A recent trip here in South Africa, I was privileged to see some ancient Khoisan rock art high on a rimrock canyon. about a 3-hour drive north of here. Thousands of years after the creation of this, you can still see the fine detail right down to like individual brush strokes. Animals such as eland and kudu are depicted in motion. You can see them running here. They're engaged by people who are harnessing, concentrating their own muscle energy through technology such as the bow and arrow. The oldest Clom stories recorded by Bleak and Lloyd from informants such as Cabo and Diaquain tell of an interplay between human and animal realms using techniques, narrative techniques of repetition. We see characters that serve as archetypes and artists blurring the line between human and non-human world. I put up a brief couple lines here from Cabo describing storytelling technique and experience language that draws on natural energy. Stories of wind, our bodies invisible, our names travel on the wind. You know, as I was there looking out over what seemed to be endless mountains, rivers, grassland, it reminded me the history of energy and humanity in South Africa and the world is far deeper and more ancient than our modern experience regularly allows us. But we do write what we know, and what we know now is a fossil fuel culture, right? This is why coming into contact, thinking consciously about the realities of oil culture is difficult, because the pipelines, extraction sites, gas tanks, they're so often hidden away, not something you engage with on a daily basis. So I'll try now to show how some somewhat more modern writers have tackled these realities. While I was a graduate student, many years ago now, I used to visit my mentor and teacher, Gary Snyder. His home was on the other side of the Sierras from Nevada and Northern California. I wanted to acknowledge his influence. Snyder's one of the greatest living nature writers. He's written in prose and poetry, often about energy, and his career has now spanned over 75 years. He's originally associated with the Beat movement in the 1950s in the US on the West Coast, along with figures like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and so on. But just as the Beat movement began to kind of take off, Snyder took a new path, and he went to Japan and studied Zen Buddhism for many years in Kyoto. When he returned to the US, he built an off-grid house in the mountains and helped create the intellectual underpinnings of a movement called bioregionalism. And he won the Pulitzer Prize for his 1970, I think 74 book, Turtle Island. But yeah, looking back at oil culture here, many of his poems could be discussed in that vein. One of the earliest is from 1958. This poem is simply titled Oil, because when Snyder was traveling to Japan, he did this a few times over about a 10-year period. He typically worked his way across the Pacific Ocean on an oil tanker and would write along the way. So I'll read Oil here. Soft rain squalls on the swells south of the Bonins late at night. Light from the empty mess hall throws back bulky shadows of winch and fair lead over the slanting fantail where I stand. But for men on watch in the engine room, the man at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the crew sleeps in cots on deck or narrow iron bunks down drumming passageways below. The ship burns with a furnace heart, steam veins and copper nerves, quivers and slightly twists and always goes. Easy roll of the hull and deep vibration of the turbines underfoot, bearing what all these crazed, hooked nations need, steel plates and long injections of pure oil. Wow, okay, so the poem is 65 years old now. I can't help but wonder if we've made much progress. Oil is an ambivalent poem in certain ways. You can see in the opening two stanzas, he creates almost a sort of domestic scene, right? His care for the other laborers on board, for the sailors, is clear. He writes elsewhere in his career about loggers, pipeline workers, others in extractive industries. Maybe not with straight affection, but he has a certain empathy or understanding for those careers. Snyder, in the middle of this poem, engages with the ship itself, right? He anthropomorphizes it. He gives it a circulatory and a nervous system. It suggests a willingness to appreciate tools of our age, maybe even something like artificial intelligence, or at least to see convenience in some of these technologies. But ultimately, at the end of this poem, that final stanza, Snyder zooms out. He examines the kind of geopolitical consequences of the oil tanker and its mission. The reason why such a ship with so many workers is crossing the ocean. The language here is shifting, right? It's no longer soft and empathetic. He's referring to the political entities as drug addicts, right? Crazed, hooked on oil that they receive through injections. So this poem, again, set 65 years old. I appreciate, because Snyder, right at the outset of some of these poems about oil, wants to focus on political entities that maintain the system rather than individuals being asked to bear the consequences. Right. Taking a little bit of a step back, I wanted to talk next about petrocultural theory. So a lot of this traces to 1992. That's when the Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh published a brief book review of a Jordanian Saudi writer, Abdel Rahman Munif, who wrote a trilogy called Cities of Salt. In his review, Ghosh coins this term Petrofiction. So that's where that language comes from. And he used it originally to talk about the oil encounter, kind of the discovery of oil. From this somewhat unlikely source, critics kind of took it and ran with it. And yet now Ghosh has circled back to the topic as well. And he's one of the kind of preeminent theorists globally on climate change and storytelling. A couple of his books would be The Great Derangement and Nutmeg's Curse. Some initial books that he wrote about or would be good connections to Petrofiction would be Upton Sinclair's 1926 film. Upton Sinclair wrote the book Oil, and the film There Will Be Blood is based on that novel. Another one that I've taught and enjoyed working with students on is Oil on Water, which is a novel from 2011 by Nigerian novelist Halan Habila. Other critics have now begun arguing that all modern writing could be about oil, right? Graham McDonald says writing is promised on the hidden costs and benefits of hydrocarbon culture. So I don't necessarily think every text is an oil text, but there is some promise there, especially if we think about the many texts that use energy as a metaphor. So for example, what happens when we apply these ideas of oil culture to the prologue of Ralph Ellison's famous novel, Invisible Man? In that prologue, the Black protagonist lives underground in a sort of cavern, illuminated by hundreds and hundreds of incandescent light bulbs that he's strung up illegally while he's poaching electricity as a sort of resistance to the racist society he encounters in New York City, moving north during the US Great Migration from the south to the north. Here's a fairly well-known artistic rendering photograph of that prologue. Some questions that something like Invisible Man raises might include how do we understand universal access to electricity in societies with systemic inequality? How can we advocate for a just transition through storytelling and the arts? Related to Invisible Man, perhaps, other aspects of oil culture do emphasize racial identity alongside those metaphors of darkness, blackness, extraction. So I wanted to look at Audre Lorde's poem Kyhl, and I'll read part of that. I is the total black being spoken from the earth's inside. There are many kinds of open. How a diamond comes into a knot of flame. How sound comes into a word, colored by who pays what for speaking. Love is a word, another kind of open. As the diamond comes into a knot of flame, I am black because I come from the earth's inside. Now take my word for jewel in the open light. Audre Lorde's poem is most typically read as works of double consciousness, kind of exploring her status as a Black lesbian poet in the US. Coal, of course, is a major global commodity and generates the vast majority of electricity in South Africa, and until recently in the US as well. What happens when we look at mountaintop coal removal or offshore oil rigs and think about Lord and Ellison? The columnist Charles Blow wrote in the New York Times a couple years ago, quote, "Black bodies are a battlefield. Black folks fight to defend them as external forces fight to destroy them. Black folks dare to see the beauty as external forces condemn and curse them." So what is that relationship between resources, people, literature? Reading South African literature this semester, I've seen similar themes for sure. One good example is by the spoken word poet and organizer Mandy Vundla. And so here's part of her poem Blackout, where she's exploring the state of race relations through imagery of load shedding, metaphors about modern energy. So here's some excerpts. I throw poems at high voltage voice for power cut boys whose hearts are beaten off the earth. It's shock therapy. For lives flashing by like the fading breath of a torch when batteries run out of blood in the dirt, we lose our energies because our history is a jumping spirit whose body cannot rest without freedom. Black lives are dead matter coming back to life. Do not short circuit, do not black out. We see how some of the language of energy and the power and violence visited on the earth are borne more heavily by Black bodies in the US and in South Africa. A thread I've also started to ponder is the number of freedom activists, anti-apartheid activists who are now also climate activists. Some of those I'm thinking of might be Kumi Naidoo from Durban, executive director of Greenpeace, who's published 2 books. Poet Dennis Brutus, who is involved, at least in some ways, with the UN climate talks, or here at NMU, somebody like Janet Cherry. Certainly that link between activism and oil resistance is strong and has been going for a while. David James Duncan and Rick Bass co-authored a book called The Heart of the Monster in 2010. This book was aimed at stopping or at least slowing the transport of oil from the Alberta tar sands by truck through the US Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. And tar sands, I'll just add, is maybe the worst form of fossil fuel extraction there is. It's just so unbelievably toxic and dirty. Yet Bass, before he became a full-time activist and writer, was a petroleum geologist. So it's an unusual career arc, but Bass wrote about that here. He said, "All my life I've leaned heavily, hungrily on what's real. I've reached down into the ground and pulled up oil from 3,000 feet below, cracking into the brittle sand reservoirs of old oceans turned to stone. How strange it is for me to consider the massive landmark, that point around which we must all pivot, And now, if we are ever to change, does not rise above the horizon at all, but is a gaping pit, a negative space. So Bass describes tar sands as the biggest threat in the world. It's an existential threat we must collectively deal with, yet very, very few people are ever allowed to see those sites. There's something you can't see until you get kind of on the precipice, looking down into it. Bass presses, though, that we have agency in this. He writes, all we have to do is have the courage to speak our name, the one thing given to us when we come into the world, and the one thing Imperial and Exxon cannot take from us. All we have to do is write our name on a sheet of paper, a citizen's initiative, and they'll go away. So this kind of activist writing might harken back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, describing a different sort of threat in the form of DDT. Another writer who's often compared to Carson is the American Sandra Steingraber, who's written about fracking. And fracking is what she calls the world's ugliest gerund. In one of her articles, she explains how shale deposits were formed geologically, then describes walking home from a community meeting about fracking proposed in her community of Ithaca, New York. She wrote, walking on an unbroken sidewalk made of shale, above an as of yet unshattered bedrock made of shale, my son said, we shouldn't wreck this place down, right, Mom? And his words drew a battle line across my heart. So you see lots of efforts to use the written word to develop awareness, to organize and engage citizens. I don't have too much time to talk about this particular poem, but it's by an Indigenous writer named Kimberly Blazer. She's actually an alum of the College of St. Benedict and now directs the creative writing program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. But she's written poetry about Standing Rock in North Dakota and the movement to resist oil pipelines such as Dakota Access Pipeline or Line 3 in Minnesota. And really, Indigenous writers have been leaders in this in recent years. So although the range of individual kinds of extraction and deposits can be a bit dizzying, coal mining, fracking, tar sands, pipelines, offshore drilling, so on and on. Perhaps the event that most catalyzed other writers about energy humanities, other thinkers, people like me, about petrocultural writing is probably the 2010 BP oil disaster. I guess it's been a little while, and I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with this, but the Deepwater Horizon was an oil rig drilling an exploratory well about 40 miles off the coast of Louisiana in water that was about 1 mile deep. So a very remote site. The immediate human cost included the lives of 11 workers on the rig who died. For the next 87 days, pretty much the entire summer that year, oil spewed uncontrolled from the broken wellhead. Again, this is a mile deep. A total of 4.9 million barrels was officially estimated to be spilled from the wellhead before it was declared capped. And then a few years later, BP was ordered to pay the largest corporate settlement in at least US history, which was about $18.7 billion. So astute readers of literature might be looking at this and saying, Macondo, what is that? That is actually, the Macondo is the name of the town in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. In that novel, the town saw a boom in population and resources, only to be completely destroyed by a natural disaster. One reason why such an explosive event might inspire so much cultural production and reorientation is suggested by Ross Barrett and Daniel Warden, who edited this collection on oil culture. They began the volume with a description of the oil that was suddenly visible during the BP oil disaster as tar balls began rolling up on beaches around the Gulf Coast, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas. They go on to explain that in most cases, This is at the bottom. Oil is not invisible to us as much as it is contained in our cars' gas tanks and pipelines and shale and tar sands and distant extraction sites. This gives oil a curious valence in the cultural imagination. It is foundational and ever present, and yet it is also secreted away. So in other words, only when we have these things hidden, being brought to the surface, do we finally and fully engage with it. So how did authors write about the BP oil disaster? How do you cope with all this oil no longer contained? A common trope not unique to America or to the year 2010 is probably the oiled bird, right? So David Gessner is a writer. He has two really great, hopeful natural history books about the migrations of ospreys. He wrote the Tarball Chronicles, a journey beyond the oiled pelican into the heart of the Gulf oil spill. So Gessner goes to an animal rehab center and finds a box there with 6 white pelicans, these giant birds. Gessner wrote, "I stare into the bird's lightless eyes, it stares back. I've always seen pelicans as the embodiment of imperturbability, since they seem so much more stolid than the other birds. The expression seems to say, what the hell has happened to me? The sight cracks me open. I've had moments when pelicans lift me out of my own life, usually brief, ineffable moments of delight. This, what I'm experiencing now, is a different sort of moment. I stay with the birds. My list of pelican facts and encounters means nothing. 6,000 birds have been found dead. It isn't these theoretical birds that concern me right now, however, but the ones inside the box." So Gessner is trying to identify and empathize with these birds, but he's soon pushed out of the center by veterinarians who are tired of photographers. Later, after BP kind of carpet bombed the slicks with chemical dispersants to make the oil no longer visible, Gessner returns to the area and to the oiled pelicans, where he interviews Bill Finch. And Finch is this, well-named naturalist, right? He works on barrier islands in Alabama. And what he told Gessner was, people want to see dead animals. They want an obvious symbol of the devastation to rally around, and that means dead oiled birds. But what we're likely to get is going to be a lot more subtle. So you can see that trope of the oiled bird visually on this poster. Hold BP accountable. This poster was displayed at metro stations in Washington, D.C. during the hearings, trying to influence members of Congress and the Justice Department to throw the book at BP. So I don't know if people think 18 million is enough. I guess it was seen as a positive amount, but they were liable for up to 50 billion. But other depictions during that time include beautiful pictures. So J. Henry Fair did aerial photography of the oil on water. This appeared in the popular environmental literature magazine Orion, along with an essay by Terry Tempest Williams, who's most famous for the book Refuge. Williams, like Gessner, they both traveled to the area from afar. They were compelled to bear witness, right? And yet it's maybe not surprising that native Louisianans didn't have that unlimited of patience for these bookish birders. Another writer, Cheryl St. Germain, who directed the MFA Master of Fine Arts Creative Writing program at Chatham College in Pittsburgh. She actually blasted Orion and Terry Tempest Williams and J. Henry Fair for these pieces. She wanted local authors, people who had grown up in Louisiana and were publishing photographs that were not so pretty. So I thought I'd read a couple things from St. Germain next. She ended up writing a 5-page kind of tour de force poem called Midnight Oil, which maybe is an oblique reference to the Australian band who wrote the protest song Beds Are Burning. St. Germain begins by explaining the spill and how we write about it. how to speak of it, this thing that doesn't rhyme or pulse in iambs or move in predictable ways, like lines or sentences. How to find the syntax of this thing that rides the tides and moves with the tides and under the tides and through the tides, and has an underbelly so deep and wide, even our most powerful lights cannot illuminate its full body. This is our soul shadow, that darkness we cannot own, the form we cannot name. Saint Germain explores family themes, including addiction. She's lost a son to drug addiction, and then turns to oiled birds and turtles. At times, she excoriates the media for running the same stories over and over again, but ultimately she does widen the scope, recognizing the spill is bigger than the gulf. We're all in this together. She continues, and this is how the poem ends. Let's ask those responsible. Some of those are us, to walk deep into the waters of this once beautiful island. The waters that once teemed with speckled trout, oysters, shrimp. Let's ask them to walk far into it, to swim out with long, sweeping strokes. And then when they are thick and covered with the stuff, when it's in their hairs and blinding them, stopping up their ears and mouths, when it's sticking to every pore in their body, then let them try to swim back. Then let them try to explain. So in these ways, Saint Germain tries to remind us of our part to play, our shares of responsibility. I feel like I only have kind of a beginner sense of environmental communication here in South Africa. I know there's problems here with oil spills and water birds, maybe especially including the African penguins that have had a crash in their population in recent years. So let's keep thinking of those seabirds and widen the scopes back to people too. Ultimately, we too are dependent on our natural environments. The theorist Stephanie Menager argues in her book Living Oil, Petroleum Culture in the American Century. She argues, quote, "We experience ourselves every day in oil, living within oil, breathing it, registering with our senses. Oil is a medium that fundamentally supports all media concerned with what counts as culture. Film, music, novels, magazines, photographs, sports, blogs, and videos. Can the category of the human persist, practically speaking, without such forms indebted to fossil fuels?" Yet, I would argue we must also ask the question, can the category of the human persist, practically speaking, with such forms so utterly indebted to fossil? My experience in South Africa and going to concerts during load shedding suggests maybe. I'm engaged today in consideration of the ways we live in petroculture, but other modes and energy are part of the human story. Petroculture hasn't always been so, and our relationship with energy is rapidly evolving. So I'll end with just one more poem, a favorite poem of mine by William Stafford. The photograph is from the turn of the last century, somewhere in Colorado. But the poem, Maybe Alone on My Bike, Stafford here blends sensory images with a call to listen and think. It serves as a quiet rebuttal to oil culture and unbridled consumption. He links his senses to those of owls. You see there's a lot of birds in my talk. Stafford here is celebrating the joy of commuting home by bike. I listen, and the mountain lakes hear snowflakes come on those winter wings. Only the owls are awake to see, their radar gaze and furred ears alert. In that stillness, a meaning shakes. And I have thought, maybe alone, on my bike, quaintly on a cold evening pedaling home, think the splendor of our life, the current unknown, as those mountains, the scene no one sees. Oh, citizens of our great amnesty, we might have died, we live. Marvels coast by, great veers and swoops of air, so bright the lamps waver in tears. And I hear in the chain a chuckle I like to hear. So in Stafford's poem, that normally unseen, right? It's made visible, and yet instead of toxicity, of horror, of tar balls, this current is one of beauty. Can we make these choices that shift the balance of energy away from consumption and what is unseen? I love to think of it. One of the great joys of my time here in South Africa has been riding along Marine Drive, sometimes alone, maybe alone, but also with new friends before the sun rises in the cold, and some of those pieces of like wavering in tears, seeing an owl on a post are very real here in the South African winter. So thank you so much for hearing and listening to these words on energy. It's really fun and satisfying to be able to share them. Happy to take questions.
Thanks, Kyhl. Thanks very much. If you wouldn't mind, maybe in the question time, just maybe taking your PowerPoint off so we can see you, in the real haha.
Yeah.
Okay, but thank you very much. And thank you for keeping us, or at least leaving us with one positive, affirmative feeling in the end, because it's quite a heavy going collection of literature that you exposed us to. Very, very interesting though. If you would like to ask questions, you can either pop them in the chat or raise your hands. I think raising your hands is probably a little bit easier for me to see at the moment. So yes, let's ask Gary first and then Mbasa after that. Okay, Gary?
Shot. Thanks, Andrea, and Kyhl, thank you for that. I mean, it's deeply moving, much of that poetry that you spoke about, and the imagery often is stark and really difficult to deal with. I mean, like you, I swam this morning along that same stretch that you cycled, and we often swim with dolphins and things like that. So so there's a sense, I don't understand how you can look at those pictures of oil and that and remain unmoved by it, and I was wondering whether, I mean, art obviously here in the broad sense of art has a role to play in documenting the decline, but does it have a transformative application in the sense of, a deep horizon has happened? I mean, when I think it was 10 or 15 years ago, has that changed the oil industry in terms of the documentation of it? That pelican, seeing the pelican in that pose. So I was just like Andrea, maybe just looking for trying to find the light in this thing. Where is the light here? But yeah, I mean, it's stunning imagery and stunning words. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I mean, there's not always good news. But one of the reasons I keep coming back to and being grateful that I've been pursuing literature and art is because it can connect you to things that are beautiful, but are not because of their monetary value, right? We're reminded of kind of these deeper values that link us to maybe those dolphins or those pelicans.
I was actually thinking, just to jump in there, that Saint-Germain, I think, or that actually expressed almost like a real frustration with words and fiction by saying, let them swim. Let them actually swim in that oily water. That would have been, a protest action of note, to have actually, if one had a political commitment to actually showing what these kinds of things do, let them swim in that water. I was just thinking about that in opposition to Gary's swim with dolphins, that if you could contrast those two and make people feel it in their bodies, not in words, not in images, not in thought, in their safe, comfortable couches, etc., but just make them get into that environment. That would be interesting. Sort of dip them
I
in
mean,
those.
we see some of this with the sorts of protest actions, especially in Europe and in the UK, where Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil members go and throw paint on famous artwork, right? There's this sense of, hey, if you think that's valuable, like, what about the natural world that makes all this possible, right? So there is something there where people are using great cultural expression as a wedge to say, hey, this is valuable, so is the world. You know, there I guess are multiple ways to approach it.
Yeah, and that's tricky because art is a valuable too in its own right. But anyway, Mbasa, sorry. Nice to meet you.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Great presentation, Kyhl. I didn't know that you were so far to the left. I knew you were a leftist, but not a perfect. Anyway, I learned tremendously in your presentation, and I think I've been inspired toward climate justice by reading the works of Naomi Klein, for instance, her book titled "Disaster Capitalism." But I have a question for you. What then would you suppose would be a solution to South Africa's energy crisis, or what we call load shedding or power outages? Yeah.
All right, thank you, Mbasa. Yeah, I guess we've gotten to talk a bit this semester, but we haven't usually gone into my own politics. Some of the earlier seminars in this series have addressed you know, potential solutions or directions for addressing the energy crisis here. I tend to certainly emphasize the importance of having more renewable energy in the mix. With the wind and the sun here, it seems like a very obvious thing to pursue. And the costs of those technologies are dropping so rapidly. I know in the US, we've halved our coal consumption in the last 15 years. So I'm hopeful that South Africa can do the same in the next 15, well, hopefully less than 15 years, because that really is the best way to go about this fastest to deploy most reliable source of energy.
Thanks. Yes. We need energy for it, which is a kind of a question. I think maybe underlying that question is, you know, where do we somehow dredge up I mean, I know literature would give us a certain amount of kind of energy for change, but not enough, because we're not changing. So the question is how to actually kind of empower, you know, give ourselves the energy to actually get moving on this. All of us. I'm not saying just them out there, the politicians, but I mean us sitting down here too. Yeah. Anyway, let me not jump in there. Jason, nice to see you too.
Hi, Andrea. Yes, no, it's lovely to be able to shed your being able to do this again. Kyhl, thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to jump in. So I'm, and perhaps speaking to this topic, I'm something of a sci-fi fan, and there's a lot of engagement along those lines. So two things that I thought might pop in, and I hope these are useful follow-ons, because I'm suddenly not sure how they connect, but I'll jump in. So one is that, speaking to how this relates to South Africa, is that a little while ago I read John Brunner's The Sheep Look Up, which was from his Club of Rome quartet, which were all of these very pessimistic novels about reaching the ends, the limits of what could be done. just before the Green Revolution, when there was not a lot of, it looked like there was too little of everything. And I related to it strongly. There's this very evocative scene in The Sheep Look Up where a rich executive is holidaying in the Caribbean, and he talks about how this is one of the better spots because you're away from the major effluent and most of the fish die-offs don't hit the beach. And I live in Zululand, and as a result of the uprising a little while ago, civil disruption a couple of years, Durban had a lot of toxic runoff, which poisoned everything up the coast because violence kind of spiraled down into environmental degradation. And this was realistic. There are literal oligarchs trying to flee possible, Russian conflicts, buying places on the coast in South Africa, and the things they can praise about the spaces here are, well, this particular site isn't too close to the chemical runoff. And it felt very real. So I wanted to say, I appreciate, because Amitav Ghosh, as you said, pointed out that most forms of fiction that address this stuff, this was the great derangement, they have to be framed as sci-fi, because there's no space to have this coexist with realism. And I'm very grateful to you for pointing to all the people who puncture that perspective, as he notes is hard to do. So then, to pivot in completely the other direction, I'm interested in the emergence of solar punk as this kind of aesthetic movement popping up, where people are trying to do that. And something that struck me about this, to pick up on your last point, is I read a solar punk story the other day, and it was the most mundane, literally mundane thing. It's a description of someone setting up their house and how they're going to run it off grid, where the water purifiers are coming from. And I think it speaks to our current chaos, that there's something almost utopian about people just describing themselves as plugging into kind of alternative energy flows that enable them and let them feel a sense of normality. And that feels revolutionary, that people are writing stories where that's the action, that's what it's about. And I thought that it strikes me as weird that is there like that. Sorry, I'll shut up now, but thank you. That's
Yeah, no, Jason, that was great to pull all those threads together. I think you're onto a lot there, and yeah, that idea of the great derangement, right? The only people who can write about these things have to be on the fringe. They have to be not sufficiently serious. It's okay for sci-fi or some genre writers, but not for the mainstream literary. But we see that that's actually, as you said, that was the big point of the book I published, was to show that this is a current that you can trace back in literary history a long ways, as well as see what the new directions are. The title of the book came from Ralph Waldo Emerson, The Currents of the Universal Being. So it was intentionally trying to say, hey, this is something that goes with some of the most canonical voices in at least American literature. We originally wanted to do global literature, but it was too big of a book. So, but certainly that's where I'm at now, because the climate is a global thing. So it's artificial to put a national boundary around it. And what you're describing with the oligarchs and so on kind of shows that there is really no safe harbor. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason. Gary, you have your.
Yeah, Kyhl, thanks very much again. I wanted to pick up on this thing about the writings making visible what's invisible to some extent. So the oil industry does operate sort of, and not necessarily in the dark per se, but it operates in spaces where people don't normally live. I mean, the oil platforms are very remote and that kind of stuff. And then just to link it, we have a seismic survey that's been planned off our coast. So I don't know if you know what that is. It's the initial stages of the discovery process of where, and the sound waves, we have great concern in terms of its impact on marine life. So what we're doing tomorrow is we're gathering a bunch of vehicles together, and we're going to give a hoot protest, and where we try and simulate the sound of the seismic in terms of, so part of the problem is that when the people analyze it, they take it as a single sound, whereas this is a cumulative thing over 4 to 5 months, 24/7, so there's 108 guns that blast at over 200 decibels underwater every 10 seconds, 24/7 for 4 to 5 months, and so the problem is that when you look at the scientific reports around it, is that the people that analyze those reports, so we assess the reports, firstly don't understand the marine environment, that it's a column, it's not two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional, and don't understand sound within that environment, and then don't understand the cumulative impact, So what we're trying to demonstrate, but obviously, some of the problems that we have is that ethical clearance for, you can't hurt animals in demonstrating the impact, so you can't actually put an egg of a spawning fish or something in water and then blast it with sound to show what the impact is. Because of ethical clearance, no university would get ethical clearance to do that. So you can't actually you can't do the science to show how that takes place. So we have to get at it through more creative ways, and so we're going to try this tomorrow. But it goes to your point about how to show what's invisible, and a lot of the marine stuff is invisible to most of humanity. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, when and where is the protest if I was to try to join?
Yeah, you're welcome to join. So it's tomorrow at Wells Estate at 8 o'clock in the morning. And we've had to move it at short notice because the circus occupied the original place that we wanted to do it, and we can't disturb the circus animals, just another day in the bay. But yeah, it's a Wells Estate, but we can drop me an email afterwards, and then we can, or I'll drop you an email and then I'll let you know where it is. It'd be great. Yeah, we need more cars hooting.
So Gary, that's a protest on the body in a way, and who will be affected by it?
So in terms of setting it up, we're trying to show the cumulative impact of sound. Now, a car horn is around about 80 to 110 decibels, depending on the one that you're using. And in water, it's slightly different. It's more compounded. But we've then had to think about harm to the humans actually doing the exercise. So we'll only do it for a minute at a time. So we'll only do sort of a hoot. So we're trying to get as many cars together. So in a seismic array, there's 108 air guns that go off simultaneously. So we were hoping for 108 cars, but we won't get it because of the remoteness of the site. But we're hoping for 30 to 50, 60 vehicles maybe. And that we will then try and synchronize them to hoot every 10 seconds, but only for a minute at a time, because for social media, we don't need longer. And then we'll have we'll have earplugs for people and things like that. So we're doing it in a remote place where there's no residential area close by, but that limits where you can do it and how you can do it.
And you'll film it.
Yeah, so we'll film it and we'll put it on social media, and so we're going to try it as a trial run tomorrow and then see, but we'll also enter it into the evidence that we give in terms of the input into the environmental assessment, so to make the point about cumulative impact. But the other things that we've had to think about, is and obviously we're driving in cars to get to the place, and we're using a car. So we're actually using fossil fuel to get there, so that's yeah, I mean, our argument is that the boat that does the seismic uses more fossil fuel just from its berth to the harbor entrance than we would use in the entire exercise. You know, so you know, yeah, it's been interesting where people's focus is, you know. So we were going to do it at King's Beach, and a lot of people were then worried about animals, the impact on sort of pets and that kind of stuff. But people don't actually know King's Beach to the effect, because it wouldn't have done it. But in people's minds, this thing played large and loud, you know. So no, it's an interesting exercise. I mean, you know, it's to Kyl's point, is how you unearth the hidden, you know, how you show up the hidden.
No, it reminds me of some of the different things that like Bill McKibben has spearheaded with 320.org and People's Climate March in New York City that I attended. Gosh, it's been a few years now, but 7 years ago or so. Just different. Yeah, how do you do something that can capture people's imagination? It's not so much different than what you're trying to do with the poem.
Yeah, you know, so like Greta Thunberg, who just on her own, without any fanfare, kept on standing in her local square, you know, and eventually media picked up on it, and then she's become an international sensation. But she never set out to do that. She just stood with her poster in her local square, you know. Yeah, so you know, so that like her fame, if I could call it that, is interesting in terms of how media has picked up on it, and how and how people have then vilified her and sort of, I don't know if sanctified is the right word, but made her a saint. You know, it wasn't her intent at all. You know, so yeah, that's a fascinating. Yeah.
Just a quick question. I think we've got a minute or two before we finish off. Is so Petrofiction is always anti-oil. It's a protest fiction. It's not. There isn't kind of affirmative Petrofiction.
You know, nobody's asked me that before. Trying to go through. You know, I would actually think there might be some somewhat positive, some of the earlier pieces, right? The idea of like, I don't know if you would have ever seen like the Beverly Hillbillies. It was this old TV show where this poor family from like Oklahoma drives to Southern California, and lo and behold, there's oil in their backyard, and they strike it rich, right? There is some of that kind of like early petrofiction, this idea of, you know, just limitless abundance and the American dream.
Might be interesting to make a comparison if there is such a.
And maybe Jason knows more. Yeah.
Yeah, Jason. Yeah.
Well, so it's kind of related, because again, there's this thing where people slap a title together, generally in social, in online communities, and you're not sure how much substance there is to it. But something I've noticed alongside, because the solar punk stuff emerges from cyberpunk and then steampunk, which was an offshoot and all of that stuff. But I've seen people doing this kind of retro thing connected to a kind of companion aesthetic of atom punk, old style stuff and it's about kind of making necessarily anachronistic pictures of abundant energy. But there are communities committed to what they call diesel punk, and they seem to be a vaguely kind of romanticized variation of the people who are rolling coal, which I suppose would be the dark side of what petrofiction would be, is people who are so committed to what's the phrase? I'm already forgetting. Olufumi Taiwo calls it vice signaling, right? Is the rolling coal would be the aesthetic equivalent of trying to signal vice and, you know, live in the darkest version of this old thing. I mean, to the extent that they make a point of making their diesel look as though it were in fact coal to emphasize it. So I suppose there are aesthetic responses, which are the dark version of these kind of activisms, but whether there's a narrative coherence to that as a genre, I don't know. But that came to mind, and I suppose it was the spin-off of all of the people making up punk as a thing things.
Okay, great. Interesting angle there. Glenn, you sort of vaguely raised your hand and then dropped it again. Do you want to pop in a last word?
Thanks, Andrea. Well, I wasn't going to say anything. I've just put my comment in the chat box to say it was a powerful seminar. And I was really encouraged by how one looks at something differently after having read something about it. And that beautiful image of the spill over the ocean, I never saw the beauty in it until I saw what you'd put there on the slide, and I could then not look at it in a different way without seeing the beauty of what the writer had mentioned as the sort of brush strokes associated with a painting and the spread of oils which one sees. So I wish that more young students were able to be part of something like this to make them fall in love with the written word again, because I've noticed that is a challenge for our youth. So if they could see how the written word could become a vehicle for their own activism. But thanks so much for a great talk.
Thanks, Glenn. Jason, is that an old hand? Or a new one?
Yes, no, sorry, that's the old hand.
Okay, all right, so old hand at this. All right, Kyhl, I think we have kind of run out of time anyway, so I would like to just thank you again for a very, very, very stimulating talk, and it will be recorded and put on YouTube. I'll let you know that as soon as I've got the link, I'll send it to you. So thank you very much, and yes, yeah. You know, continue the struggle. Yeah. Okay.
All right. And yeah, thank you. It was really a pleasure to be here.
All right. Okay. Cheers. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Kyhl.